Welcome, welcome, welcome to the most recent iteration of our webinar series. My name is Kara Jordan. I am the co-founder and COO at Flatpage, and I'm here to welcome you to this webinar hosted by my editorial manager, Ben Clifford, on how to prepare your journal article for submission. I'm excited to hear what he has to say today. In case you missed today's proceedings, we will host them online through our YouTube channel. So if you're not taking copious notes, don't worry, it'll be up and ready. You can find a list of all of our upcoming and past webinars on our website. They're there under our resources. So if you want to check out a webinar that you potentially missed or sign up for the next one, which will be happening shortly, then take a look there. Just a reminder for today that we're going to ask you to keep your microphone muted and your video off so that we can focus on Ben's presentation. And without further ado, I am going to introduce Ben Clifford. He's our editorial manager here at Flatpage, so he oversees all of our editors and all the projects that come our way. He has a lot of experience in this area about pitching articles to academic journals, but from the editorial side and as a peer reviewer, so you get to see sort of the backside of what's happening here at the journals. And if you have any questions along the way, please either pose them in the chat or send them directly to me. And at the end, once Ben has finished with his presentation, then we'll have a little bit of a chat here. So without further ado, Ben, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Kara, and hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Benjamin Clifford. I'm the editorial manager here at Flatpage, and today we are going to be talking about the ins and outs of submitting your work to academic journals. First, a little bit about me. I did a PhD in art history at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. And since 2019, I've been one of the editors of the Brooklyn Rail, a monthly art and culture magazine based in New York. As Kara said, at Flatpage, I coordinate the day-to-day work of our editorial team and handle communications with the authors who seek us out. Many of them are academics looking to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And this is a goal that we help facilitate in various ways that we'll discuss today. At the same time, a lot of writers that I work with at the Rail are also career academics at various stages of their professional lives. So between my own background in academia and my more recent work, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to successfully carry out academic writing projects and helping other scholars make it happen. Peer-reviewed journals are a really powerful tool for pushing your career as a scholar forward. I'm an art historian, and in that field, when we think about getting tenure in the US at least, the first thing that usually comes to mind is publishing a book. A lot of early career scholars find themselves in a hurry to turn their dissertation into a book, for example. But this isn't always really the best way forward. In some other disciplines, for example, some areas of the social sciences, articles are really much more heavily prioritized. Also, some research will simply make more of an impact if it's presented as a standalone article rather than embedded within the larger arc of a book. Articles are also typically published on a shorter timeline than books. So if you have an intervention that you want to make in a timely conversation that's taking place within your field, an article can be a more effective way to establish your name and begin building your reputation as a junior academic. As you progress in your career as a scholar, the incentives shift, but they're still very present. A mid-career or established academic can use journal articles as a way to develop their thinking and explore new material, while a senior scholar with a lot of clout can also use journal articles to make a really significant impact in steering the overall direction of their discipline. It's also important to recognize that in contexts outside the US, standards can be very different. I was recently told, for example, that scholars in the Middle East are expected to produce 4 to 5 journal articles every year in order to advance their careers. And this applies to all fields. In the Middle Eastern context, books just aren't seen as particularly relevant when compared to journal articles. But ultimately, the process of publishing in a peer-reviewed journal isn't always straightforward. And there are a number of hurdles to clear on the way to a successful submission and publication. Okay, so what is it that makes publishing in academic journals difficult? First, there are a few general factors that are worth considering. Because publishing in peer-reviewed journals is desirable and it's so useful for professional development throughout a scholar's career, they get a lot of submissions and acceptance rates can be quite low. Um, like most of what we're going to talk about today, it varies by discipline and by journal, but most well-regarded journals in the social sciences and the humanities will have acceptance rates somewhere between 10% and at the top end, somewhere around 40%. These less selective journals, the 40% group, ish group, would likely be those that focus on narrower subject matter. So they simply get less submissions and can accept more of the ones that they do get. Older journals, more established journals, and the most prestigious journals, so the ones that are really the most desirable to gain access to as a scholar, these can be significantly more selective, some even accepting less than 5% of all the submissions that they receive. In my field, for example, Art Journal reports an acceptance rate of just 3% of total submissions. Beyond the sheer number of submissions that they're dealing with, academic journals also need to enforce strict standards of quality using both in-house editorial review and external peer review to ensure that they're publishing only the best, most impactful research. All of this means that when submitting, you need to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. But the process itself is complex and it can be unfamiliar, especially for junior academics. Early career scholars who are trying to establish themselves are the ones who are likely going to be most eager to break into the conversation within their discipline. And ultimately, they stand to gain more than an established scholar by publishing in a prestigious journal. But ironically, they will often also face the most difficulty in making it happen. So, the first thing that you're going to want to consider when preparing to submit your article is finding the right journal. This is really crucial to think through thoroughly. It doesn't matter how groundbreaking your research is or how compelling your writing if the journal that you're submitting to is just fundamentally a bad fit for the material. A good place to start here is to map your field and the publications within it. Figure out exactly where you fit within the larger ecosystem of your discipline. Journals use different criteria to define the scope of what they publish. Some take a very wide view, operating at the top level of a discipline, but for these, you are also going to face the broadest competition. Other journals will take a particular subject within the discipline as their focus, and others still will address a particular chronological period, maybe, or a particular methodology. And thinking about these categories and traits when you're planning to submit will help you find the journal that is going to bring your article to its most receptive audience. In art history, just to give a simple example, while the College Art Association's journal Art Bulletin covers the entire scope of art history, their other publication, Art Journal, focuses mainly on 20th and 21st century art. And meanwhile, the very well-known journal October has the same chronological focus. They also focus on modern and contemporary art, but it historically has prioritized texts with a pretty specific theoretical orientation. Those that are engaging with post-structuralism and, in many cases, neo-Marxian critiques. So it's important to be aware of these factors. One simple way to locate your own article within this larger disciplinary map that you're building out is to look at who you're citing. Are there particular publications that appear frequently in your article? And look also at the evidence that your key sources use. So who are the people that you are citing? This is going to help you identify where your intervention will be the most relevant. Another simple thing you can do is to look at the makeup of a journal's editorial board. At the end of the day, the people who are sitting behind the editor's desk are going to be shaping the priorities of the journal. So understanding the way they approach their own work can be very helpful in locating your article as well. And finally, when picking a journal to submit to, don't ignore your own timeline and your own reasons for publishing. If you're trying to publish to bolster a job or fellowship application or maybe a tenure review, make sure to assess the journal's timeline for publication. Journals that publish infrequently may not necessarily suit your needs in a case like this. Okay, now that you've found the ideal journal to submit your article to, you need to turn your attention to the text itself. When preparing to submit, there are a pretty wide variety of revisions that you may want to make. It's essential that the manuscript you submit be as strong as possible. You really don't want any writing problems getting in the way of communicating your ideas to the journal editors or reviewers. There are three general classes of revisions that your text may benefit from at this point. They're shown here on this slide, moving from big picture issues on the left to the fine details on the right. The first thing you will want to think about is the content and structure of your text. This includes clarifying your thesis and methodology, strengthening the article's organization, and really focusing in on the scholarly contribution that you're making. Once these large-scale issues are handled, it's time to take a detailed look at the language of the text. You need to make sure that your text is clear, that it takes an appropriate tone, and that your use of language is really geared to your intended audience. Then finally, you'll want to make sure that the manuscript is free from any errors and that it's formatted as your journal of choice requires. This level of professional polish reinforces your authority as a scholar, and it assures reviewers that you're not taking them or their time for granted when they engage with your article. Now, not every text is going to need a deep dive into all of these categories, but you want to keep them in mind and make sure that all the boxes are checked when you're preparing your article for submission. Now, let's talk about each one of these categories in a bit more depth. When thinking about the big picture of the content and structure of your article, it's important to think critically about how you communicate your thesis and the methodology that you're employing in your analysis. In principle, these elements should be well established to begin with. As a career academic, you are ultimately the expert on your subject and the mode of analysis that you've chosen. It's not really likely that anyone else will have thought quite as deeply as you have about how your topic and your methodology operate in the particular context that you're dealing with. However, making your expertise clear to readers is a different issue. And this is where the structure and argumentation of your article is critical. When submitting to a journal, you really have limited room to work. And you need to make sure that three things are crystal clear to the journal's editors and to peer reviewers, should they be looking at your work. First, what is your position within your field? What conversations are you intervening in? And what is your relationship with existing scholarship? Secondly, what is the methodology or theoretical framework that you're using to guide your analysis? Third, and maybe most important, what is the unique contribution to the field that your scholarship is bringing to the table? These are all issues that really should be made explicit early in your article, but the overall organization of the text needs to foreground and highlight them as well. If your article moves unpredictably from one case study to the next, readers can lose sight of the larger stakes and the significance of your arguments. So think carefully about the overall trajectory of the text and make sure that it reinforces and puts a spotlight on what's important and distinctive about your argument. Effective signposting is very helpful here. Establishing this clarity around your thesis, your methods, and the contribution you're making is really, really crucial when submitting for publication because journals are going to be looking for texts that align with their own approaches. So don't leave editors or reviewers in any doubt that your article is going to be a good fit for their publication. Important thing to consider when you are thinking about the big picture of content and structure is how they need to change according to the format of your text. Journal articles can be adapted from various different types of writing. Books or dissertation chapters, um, qualifying papers, even sometimes conference papers can be great sources for standalone journal articles. But the thing to recognize here is that each format has its own specific demands. The argument of a book chapter, for example, needs to be extracted from the larger armature of the book to stand on its own effectively. At the same time, you may find that some material from elsewhere in your book may need to be brought in explicitly if the original text assumes the reader will have already encountered it in another chapter. A dissertation chapter is going to pose similar challenges. But a dissertation also requires you to effectively show your work, to detail your research and rehearse your expertise to a degree that a journal article really doesn't require. So be ruthless when you're assessing what can be cut or minimized if you are adapting a book or a dissertation chapter um, to a journal article. I remember when I was thinking about how to convert one of the chapters of my dissertation into a standalone article, um, it was already too long, and I ended up identifying a 20-page section that could effectively be reduced to maybe a footnote of just a few sentences. And I loved that section. It was a deep dive into the history of literary criticism around detective fiction and the role that the genre played in the construction of literary postmodernism. So it was lots of fun, but it just wasn't necessary in the context of a focused journal article. Conference papers are a bit of a different proposition because they already stand on their own and are close to the scale of a journal article. But a conference paper is designed to be experienced and understood in spoken form, not on the page. So, in order for it to work as a journal article, it'll need to be drastically retooled, if not entirely reconceived. Ultimately, you need to be realistic about what's necessary to make your text work as a journal article. And don't be afraid to rewrite comprehensively. Making this kind of large scale revision can be a daunting task. So working with a developmental editor can be really helpful here in helping you kind of formulate a game plan. Um, but sometimes if the issues that are in play in your text really require deep subject matter expertise to resolve, feedback from your colleagues or especially your advisor may be more appropriate at this stage. Okay, once you've assessed that big picture and you've locked in the structure and overall argumentation of your text, you're going to want to make sure that your ideas are coming through as clearly as possible. This means looking at your writing at the paragraph, sentence, and phrase level. Consider the tone and the rhythm of your language. Ask yourself, are your sentences varied in length? Do they flow effectively with one thought leading coherently into the next? The way that your text kind of sounds to a reader has a big effect on how they receive your ideas. Transitions from paragraph to paragraph are also something to hone in on at this point. How you progress from one topic or subtopic to the next is really crucial to building your argument in an effective way through the text. This moment of looking closely at the language of your article is also an opportunity to assess your use of discipline-specific terminology. And here you need to strike a fine balance because it's important and necessary to use technical terms or jargon from your field in order to demonstrate that you understand it and to effectively participate in the discourse that's taking place in your discipline. But you also have to be very strategic because too much dense or esoteric terminology is going to make your writing unengaging and ultimately limit your reach. Finally, when you're making these kinds of revisions, always keep the word count requirements of the journal you're submitting to in mind. Um, Now, if your text is way too long, then obviously you need to address that when you're looking at the structure and the bigger picture of the text. But if it's just a question of cutting, a couple hundred words in order to get down to a journal's limit, uh, this moment of looking at the language closely is a great opportunity to trim some unnecessary words and make sure that you are under the journal's uh, word count restrictions. Modifiers, in particular, adverbs and adjectives, are often great candidates to cut if you just need to reduce the length of your text a little bit without losing the meat of your content and argument. At this stage, getting your text in front of another pair of eyes is really, really helpful. It's easy for elements of our writing style to become kind of invisible to us as the author. So a second reader can really help point out problems that may not be visible to you as the author. This kind of close look at the style and tone of your writing is going to be particularly important for academics who are looking to publish in a second language. Um, Although the overall situation is improving, English does remain the dominant language of academia and international research. So scholars from non-English speaking regions have good reasons to publish in English language journals. That said, some scholars in the humanities and social sciences will sometimes publish in other languages that are appropriate to their specific subject matter. And this can be a good option, but you need to balance this kind of content specificity with the need to reach as wide an audience as possible, especially if you're an emerging scholar. And in those cases, publishing in an English language journal is often going to be the best route for you. So, if you are trying to publish in English as a second language, take the time to make sure your text is going to read naturally to your target audience. Even in an anonymous peer review situation, unconscious bias against multilingual authors can play a role, as reviewers can be prone to discount the ideas that you're presenting due to awkward sentence constructions or grammatical problems in the text. Translation is also an option for authors looking to publish in a second language, but never assume that a translated text is ready to submit as is. I strongly recommend working with a multilingual translation editor or a line editor to make sure any issues have been thoroughly resolved before you submit a translation of your article to a journal. Once you've had a close look at the language, the final stage of preparing your manuscript for submission is to take a look at the fine details and weed out any errors of spelling, grammar, and punctuation in the text. This kind of professional polish, as well as proper formatting, are essential to making the right impression on journal editors and peer reviewers. One senior academic that I spoke to who has served as a peer reviewer many times told me that nothing irritates her as much as receiving a text that's obviously a rough draft with, various errors of spelling and grammar throughout. So do what you have to make sure that your text is free from these problems. Taking the time to address them demonstrates your seriousness as a scholar, and it bolsters your credibility, which is one of the most important things that you can cultivate as a scholar. This stage of revision, where you're really carrying out a final polish, is also a good opportunity to review your citations and the documentation of your sources. Make sure that you've included all the necessary information and that your references are formatted correctly. Again, taking the time to make sure your sources and evidence are properly documented reinforces your authority and the credibility of your research. And when you're carrying out this final polish on your article, you're also going to want to consider the journal's specific requirements around style and formatting. Many journals use their own internal style guides, and their requirements are not always straightforward. In some cases, journals will largely follow established guidelines, like those outlined by the Chicago Manual of Style or the American Psychological Association, or in the UK, Harvard Style, for example. But there are often places, even when they are kind of leaning on these established resources, there are often places where they're going to diverge from those standards in ways that are not necessarily intuitive. Um, It isn't always necessary, I should say, to follow formatting guidelines to the letter at the submission stage, and some journals will note this in their instructions to authors. But even in these cases, familiarizing yourself with the requirements is a really good idea. And if implementing them isn't too arduous, it can only strengthen the impression that your text makes. One further detail to consider at this point is the distinction between US and UK English. Journals typically publish in one or the other of these variants of English, so you're going to want to tailor your manuscript accordingly. And I should note, this isn't just a question of vocabulary and spelling, the difference between pants and trousers. UK and US English, they also take different approaches to which punctuation you need to use in specific situations and how it should be placed in relation to the surrounding text. So it's good to drill down into the details here. Even in this case, though, sometimes journal requirements aren't totally straightforward. I recently encountered, for example, a journal that publishes in UK English, but they prefer the more characteristically American IZE endings for words like contextualize rather than the more familiar British ISE. So make sure to carefully scrutinize the instructions that the journal is providing, because the ins and outs here can be complex. Working with a skilled copy editor at this stage can be really, really useful as well, because they are going to have the experience to help you understand and implement whatever it is that the journal requires from you in terms of formatting and style. Now, once all this is taken care of, once your text has been thoroughly revised and it's ready for submission, the last thing that you're going to want to do is to prepare a few supplemental materials that accompany it. The most important of these is your abstract. This is going to be a short and engaging summary of your article, usually somewhere in the range of 150 to 250 words. And the journal that you're submitting to, they will let you know their specific requirements. The abstract is a powerful tool to help people find your work. So make sure to include key terms that people interested in your subject may be searching for in online databases. Many journals are also going to ask you to provide a set of standalone keywords or phrases to further facilitate the online discoverability of your text. Some disciplines, like medical research, for example, have standardized lists of descriptors that you can draw on, but in other cases, it's going to be at your discretion. The key when picking these keywords is to be specific enough to distinguish your particular topic from the larger scope of your discipline, but not so granular that your text is only going to be found by those who are already expert in the subject. Finally, if you're including figures or illustrations in your text, make sure that you consult your journal's guidelines for how these should be submitted. In some cases, they can just be integrated into the text, but in others, they're going to need to be extracted and submitted either individually or potentially gathered together into a separate document. So again, make sure to look carefully at the instructions for authors so that you know exactly how these elements need to be presented in a submission. Once you've got your text and your supplemental materials all gathered and ready, it's time to actually submit them. And there are just a few things I want to note about the process of actually submitting your article. The vast majority of journals today will require you to use an online portal. Scholar One is an extremely common example that many journals use. These portals are fairly straightforward, but beyond actually uploading your manuscript, they will often ask you for various other pieces of information that you'll want to have ready. Among the things you'll need are data like the total number of figures in your text, the specific number of color figures, the number of tables if there are any, and the total word count of your article. You can also be asked to confirm various things. These include verifying that your main text is free of any information that could identify you as the author. This is really important for peer review in many cases. You may also have to confirm that you have permission to reproduce any material within the text that's protected by copyright. And in some cases, you may also need to supply proof to corroborate the fact that you've gotten permission, even at the submission stage. So this is something to be aware of. Finally, you may be asked to confirm the authorship of the article, especially if they're co-authors. and verify that you haven't submitted the text for consideration anywhere else. It's typically considered a really big no-no to submit the same text to multiple journals simultaneously. And if it's discovered that you've done this, the journal will likely take steps in response. Beyond rejecting your submission, they will probably reach out to the other journal and inform them as well so that they can reject your submission too. One last detail to think about around submission, you may want to acquire an ORCID number. This is a free and unique digital identifier that you can use to tag all of your publications online. This will help you build out a coherent and well-verified body of work across different digital platforms, and it ensures that your work is properly attributed. This is going to be especially useful if you have a fairly common name that could potentially be confused with that of another scholar. I know in art history, there are multiple scholars named John Hay, for example, and they even work in the same field. So they would really benefit from this kind of thing. It's useful to have. Okay, now you've identified the ideal journal, you've prepared your manuscript, and you've submitted it. What happens next? One possibility, unfortunately, is that you may receive what's called a desk rejection. This means that the journal editors have determined that your text isn't going to be a good fit, and so they've not advanced it to further stages of review. More likely, assuming that you've planned and prepared well, is that your text will be sent out for peer review. This is the last major hurdle that you need to clear in order to get your article accepted. When your text is sent out for peer review, the journal editors will typically recruit 2 to 3 readers from your field. These are going to be experts who can assess your arguments, your methods, and your evidence. The social sciences and the humanities favor double-blind review. This means that the reviewers won't know your name, and you also won't know theirs. In the hard sciences, often the reviewers will know who you are, but still you won't know their identities. Ultimately, the reviewers are going to be assessing many of the same qualities that you will have hopefully addressed during your preparation of the text. They'll want your ideas to be clearly expressed and your arguments to be rigorous and well supported by evidence. As experts in your field, they're going to be very well attuned to your position within the discipline, as well as the unique contributions or new data that your research is bringing to the table. These are all things that they're going to evaluate. After reading your article carefully, each reader will prepare a report outlining their feedback and will also make a recommendation to the journal. The 3 general categories of recommendation are what you see here on this slide: accept, reject, or revise and resubmit. If a reader recommends accepting the article, there are 2 ways that this can play out. Accepting an article as is without any further changes is very rare. Usually some kind of revision is required. However, if a reviewer recommends that your paper be accepted with revisions, that means that they think the work that needs to be done to it is probably not too dramatic or comprehensive. If a reviewer, on the other hand, feels that the article has really serious problems in the way that it's conceived, or that it's simply a bad fit for the journal in question, they may recommend that it be rejected outright. In other cases, the text's bones may be okay. It may have a solid foundation, but if the reviewer feels the current state of the text is just too far from publishable to make it worth everyone's time to proceed, they may also recommend that it be rejected. But probably the most common response you'll receive is revise and resubmit. This means that the reviewer thinks that the article has good potential for publication, but needs some serious revision in order to get there. You really should be prepared to take reviewer feedback on board and address it seriously. It's a normal part of the process that like I say, you need to be prepared for. When you receive your reader reports, it can be a challenging experience. You will have spent a lot of time and effort thinking through your article and getting it ready for submission. So you may not immediately be as receptive to critical feedback as you could be. If taking account of reader feedback and implementing it seems particularly daunting, this is another area where working with a developmental editor can be very helpful. They can help you cut through the noise, identify what's most critical in the reader reports, and then formulate a game plan for your revisions. At the end of the day, though, Reviewer reports are really, really valuable for developing your ideas and your scholarship. This is an opportunity to receive serious, sustained feedback from your peers in the field, not an opportunity that should be taken lightly. One recommendation that I hear a lot when dealing with um, reader reports is not to rush into your revisions. First, this is going to give you time to thoroughly digest the feedback that you've been given. But secondly, if your reader reports are recommending serious changes, it can raise eyebrows if you return your revisions too quickly. Personally, when I work with writers, if I recommend structural revisions and I get something back immediately, it makes me feel like the author hasn't really thought through my feedback or implemented it particularly well. Also, always keep in mind that a negative reader report isn't the end of the road. I recently spoke with an early career academic whose article received an enthusiastic accept recommendation from one reviewer, while the other felt that it should be rejected outright. This author wrote to the journal editor and explained that although both reports were really useful, she believed the negative reviewer fundamentally disagreed with her methodological approach. The journal editor agreed with this and said that after revisions were carried out, they would send it to a different reviewer for assessment. So the takeaway here is that while you need to respond to reader reports seriously, that doesn't mean you necessarily need to agree with everything they say or necessarily implement everything that they recommend. And in the end, hopefully, once you've received the reader reports, taken on board their feedback, the result is going to be a stronger article that now should be well on its way to publication with the big hurdles cleared and a relatively smooth path ahead of you. Um, so I hope all of this has been informative and useful. Again, many thanks for attending. I'm happy to take a few questions. So what have we got, Kara?
Thanks so much, Ben. If anyone has any questions, please pose them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll get us started with maybe a bit of a low ball question, but we see a lot of different approaches to giving a title to your journal
Mhm.
article. Some people make them really snappy and think being smart is
Mhm.
the best option, while others tend to make them really long and descriptive. And I'm wondering if you have a recommended approach as an editor.
Yeah, I do. I mean, you've mentioned already a couple of the pitfalls here. I mean, I know that we have all experienced the seduction of a good pun in your article title or, clever wordplay. But ultimately, I think this should be avoided. It's not really doing the work that you need your title to be doing, especially in this day and age where the bulk of your readership is going to be online. You need to approach your title in much the same way that you do your abstract. It needs to be accurate to your research and it needs to be engaging. But really, this is a powerful tool that will allow people to find your article within extensive and difficult to navigate online databases. So you need to think about the search engine optimization of your title. You need to use appropriate keywords that are going to help, sift it to the surface within these online repositories. And you certainly don't want to go too long. 10 to 15 words at the most, probably for any title. And also you do, this is another case where you are going to want to look closely at your journal's requirements because some journals have very, very specific standards for the titles that they use, including, character counts, capitalization style, various other things. So first of all, consult your journal's guidelines. Second of all, certainly not too long. Keep it efficient. Eliminate kind of, uh, I guess, placeholder words like a study of or new research on. You probably don't need that. You want high impact keywords that are going to help people find your article and immediately kind of hook them in.
Great. Susie asked a question that I'm going to sort of piggyback on. She says, or she asked, what is the timeline or common timeline like for, first of all, the evaluation of the submission? So maybe the first sort of internal desk round, and maybe also thinking about peer review. And then second, for revisions and publication, provided that all goes well. And maybe you could also add on to that, what are some of the common things that hold one's article up
Mhm.
in the pipeline?
Yeah. So the timeline for publication, unfortunately, there isn't really any hard and fast answer here because it is going to vary journal by journal, but there are a few things to keep in mind. One is that I'll say about the peer review process, you are kind of at the mercy of the reviewers, and it can really drag on. It can take months and months. Um, that said, one thing to keep in mind is digital journals are pretty universally going to be faster to publication than print-only journals. Although they may potentially come with less prestige. You have to evaluate that journal by journal. But you should, when you're submitting to a peer-reviewed journal, you do need to be prepared for a months long process to get through first the editorial review, then the peer review, then making your revisions, returning them. I mean, and sometimes I hate to say it, but like an article can go through multiple rounds of revisions. One of the scholars I spoke to when I was preparing this told me about a colleague of hers whose article it went through like four rounds of uh essentially like four rounds of like revise and resubmit feedback and revisions. So it can take a while. But different journals do have different reputations. So if you look into it, you can get a sense for which journals are a bit sluggish and which maybe move a little faster. And if you do need to prioritize a quick timeline, online only journals are a good option for you. As far as avoiding hangups in the process, I would say one thing, make your text as polished as it can be to begin with. That's going to help smooth the process. Um, and also, one thing that you can really do to prevent like hangups late in the process is if there are permissions questions around your paper, make sure that you have all of the rights and permissions stuff in order and taken care of as early as you can because if you haven't done that homework, you could get to the point where your paper has been accepted, it's through peer review, and now you're in the stage where you need to make sure all the formatting is correct and all the permissions are in place. Suddenly you find that, the owner of the rights to your critical images is, not playing ball, and suddenly, God knows how long it's going to take to figure that out. So getting all of that stuff lined up as early as possible is going to help smooth the process.
Great. It also surprised me to learn that there are different areas of the world where the focus is primarily on journal articles over books, like in the US, especially for career advancement. And I'm wondering for, those scholars who are out there that need to publish 4 or 5 articles per year, if you had any tips or strategies that they might use to meet that goal.
To be honest, it's tough. I mean, keeping up that kind of work rate on top of teaching responsibilities and committee duties at your institution I mean, it's a hurdle, that's a lot of material. But what I would say is, especially if you are an early or kind of early mid-career academic and still kind of looking to build your profile within the discipline, you may need to publish 4 or 5 articles a year. I would recommend that you triage them a little bit. You're going to want to put a lot of focus on maybe 1 or 2 articles that you're aiming for high prestige, high impact publications. And then for the remainder, maybe look at those digital only journals because you can get them through the process quicker and you're already getting the high impact ones with the 1 or 2 that you're really putting a lot of time and energy into. Another option, I mean, this is one thing that you have to be aware of in terms of your institution because the requirements for advancement do differ institution to institution, and some have very very specific and stringent requirements about X number of articles of this type, Y number of articles of that type, and so on. But another thing to consider, and not all institutions are going to take these into account, but if your institution does, conference proceeding papers can be a good option as well if you are really, you're kind of scrambling to like get that volume out.
Great. And I know you
Oh,
meant,
sorry, I just want to know the thing about the problem with conference proceeding papers, though, is that they're often not peer reviewed. So in some cases, they might not count. So you'd have to be aware of those the niceties there.
great. You mentioned a little bit about unconscious bias, and I wonder outside of language issues and making sure that your journal article reads in, what we might call fluid or native English. Do you have any other tips for scholars working in multiple languages for how they might avoid unconscious bias from peer review?
It's a good question. And it's tricky though, I think the main thing, honestly, beyond making sure that, there aren't any kind of surface level language or writing problems, the main thing is really to kind of drill down into those kind of big picture essential factors that really anyone is going to be attending to in the paper. Make sure that, your paper is well located within the discipline. Make sure that you make your argument clearly. Make sure that your contribution is really front and center. You know, make sure that the journal editors, the peer reviewers are not going to be any doubt that there's no doubt that your journal or your article makes sense for their journal. It's not so much about like if you're writing from somewhere else in the world, or your topic is kind of localized somewhere outside of Europe or the US. The point is not so much to kind of like ingratiate yourself with European and or American standards, so as much as just kind of focusing on the fundamentals and making sure that your article is well articulated and makes sense for the outlet that you're shooting for.
Great advice. And finally, the now trending question is AI. And I'm wondering if you have any views about how journal editors are thinking about AI in terms of content drafting, language improvement, and in manuscript preparation.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, obviously, this is a hot button issue, and one that has become more and more urgent in recent years. I can say that I think for most journals, the big thing, I mean, well, again, this is something you're gonna want to dig into what a specific journal has to say about this, because they are going to have different stated policies around it. But what I've seen is that really transparency is kind of paramount. So if you're using AI for anything that's even remotely substantive in putting together your article, you need to disclose that very, very clearly. If you're using it for something like correcting the grammar, oftentimes that doesn't necessarily need to be disclosed. Although personally, I would advise against leaning on AI for those purposes, because in my view, it's much more useful to have a trustworthy set of human eyes engaging with your text and checking the fine details. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've seen journals, they will, they certainly do not want you leaning on AI too heavily for anything substantive. Some of the language you'll encounter, I've seen them say like, LLMs do not meet our criteria for authorship at this time, which I thought was kind of a funny way to put it. But yeah, I mean, again, but the name of the game is transparency. If you are using AI, don't try to sneak it by anybody. Disclose it in full. Personally, I recommend against it in general. But if you're going to, just, don't try to pull the wool over anybody's eyes.
Thanks so much, Ben, for all of your tips. Again, this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, and we hope you stay tuned for our upcoming iterations in the series. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everybody.